Picture this. You wake up and the power is out. Not for an hour, not for a day, gone, with no timeline for when it comes back. The air conditioning is dead in the middle of a war. Your food is rotting in a fridge that stopped working 6 hours ago. Down the street, the hospital has switched to emergency generators, and those generators have a fuel limit. Across the city, water pumps are offline. Factories are shut. The government is on television telling you there is no quick fix because the power plant that supplied electricity to millions of people was just targeted by Iranian missiles. Iran's military launched a major missile barrage aimed at the Orot Rabin power station in the coastal city of Hadera, sending thick plumes of smoke rising near one of Israel's most strategically critical energy facilities. The missiles didn't just carry warheads, some of them carried a message, literally inscribed on the weapons themselves. "We are ready, Orot Rabin." That is not an accident. That is a deliberate, calculated signal to every government watching this conflict. Iran is choosing its targets, and it is telling you exactly what it has lined up next. The Orot Rabin power station isn't just a large building with some generators inside. It sits in the Hadera area on Israel's Mediterranean coast and has been a cornerstone of the country's electricity grid for decades. It is one of Israel's largest coal-fired power plants, a massive interconnected facility with turbines, cooling systems, transmission infrastructure, and control systems that took years to construct and billions of dollars to build. Estimates put the total value of the facility at $4.2 billion. That number matters because it tells you something about what it would take to replace or fully repair it. This is not a generator you swap out. This is heavy infrastructure, and when it takes serious damage, you are looking at months of repair work under the best conditions. And Israel is not currently operating under the best conditions. It is in the middle of an active war. Iranian state media had actually telegraphed this strike days in advance. Infographics circulating on official channels showed Orot Rabin and Rutenburg, Israel's second-largest power plant, clearly marked as potential targets. The question was never really if, it was when. And that when just arrived. To understand why Iran is hitting Israeli power plants in March 2026, you have to go back to the night everything changed. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated surprise military strike on Iran in the middle of the night with no public warning. They destroyed nuclear facilities. They hit military bases, missile production sites, and command structures. And in the opening hours of the attack, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The death toll from those early U.S.-Israeli strikes reached at least 1,300 people. Iran's response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of missiles and drones fired at Israeli cities, at American military installations across the Middle East, and at Gulf countries that Tehran viewed as complicit in the attack. The war that most experts had predicted for years had finally, catastrophically, arrived. Since that first night, both sides have been escalating. America and Israel have been targeting Iran's military infrastructure, energy facilities, and leadership structures. Iran has been firing back at Israeli cities, at American bases, and at Gulf states like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. The conflict has been widening week by week, and one of its most immediate global consequences hit markets almost immediately. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows, was effectively blockaded by Iran. Oil prices shot up over 25% within days. Goldman Sachs warned prices could exceed $100 per barrel. They already have. And now, against that backdrop, Iran has hit a $4.2 billion civilian power plant. Here is something a lot of coverage misses about this strike. Iran is not trying to win this war in the traditional military sense. It literally cannot. America has the most powerful military in human history. Israel has some of the most sophisticated air defense and precision strike systems on the planet. Iran does not have the Air Force, the aircraft carrier fleet, or the satellite-guided weapons technology to go head-to-head with that combination in a conventional fight. So Iran is fighting a completely different kind of war. Analysts from the Soufan Center describe it as a war of endurance. Prolong the conflict, expand the economic battlefield, make the costs increasingly prohibitive, and impose steady human and financial pressure on adversaries with the specific goal of eroding political will faster in Jerusalem and Washington than in Tehran. Every week the war continues, Iran bets that the economic pain becomes more politically unmanageable for democratic governments than for a regime that doesn't answer to voters. Hitting the Orot Rabin facility fits perfectly into that framework. Al Jazeera's analysis confirms Iran has been targeting civilian infrastructure, airports, desalination plants, oil storage sites, specifically to reshape the regional, economic, and supply chain environment. When you destroy a military base, you hurt the military. When you destroy a power plant, you hurt everyone. Every family that loses electricity, every hospital struggling on backup power, every business that can't open, These are the pressure points Iran is squeezing, not to win a battlefield, to make ordinary people demand their government stop fighting. Israel's electricity network is not a simple system with abundant redundancy options. It is a tightly managed grid where large stations like Orot Rabin play a non-replaceable short-term role. When a facility generating that much power suddenly goes offline or has its output severely reduced, the entire network comes under immediate stress. Other stations have to compensate. The risk of cascading failures rises. Blackouts become more probable across wider areas. In the middle of an active war, this stops being an inconvenience and becomes a strategic problem. Israel needs electricity to run radar arrays, communication networks, hospital emergency rooms, air defense coordination hubs, and military command infrastructure. Losing significant generating capacity under those conditions is not something you can paper over with a few phone calls to repair crews. The hospitals across the affected region have already activated emergency protocols. Backup generators have come online, but generators run on fuel, and fuel runs out. They are built for short emergencies, not extended outages that could drag on for weeks. If the damage to the grid is severe enough to cause prolonged blackouts in the areas Orot Rabin supplied, the humanitarian situation inside Israel could deteriorate in ways the country has not experienced in decades. The people sitting in the dark tonight are not soldiers. They are civilians, parents, patients, workers. And they are the ones absorbing the cost of a decision made in Tehran. Days before the strike on Orot Rabin, Iran issued explicit public warnings to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. The message from Iran's military was direct. If attacks on Iran's fuel and energy infrastructure continue, all energy, IT, and desalination infrastructure belonging to the US and Israel in the region will be targeted. That includes power plants. That includes the UAE's Baraka nuclear facility, a 4-reactor plant that is a cornerstone of Abu Dhabi's energy infrastructure. But the most chilling part of that threat wasn't the power plants. It was the desalination facilities. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain do not have rivers. They do not have natural freshwater lakes. Almost every drop of drinking water in those nations comes from massive desalination plants that pull salt out of seawater. Analysts who spoke to France 24 described a potential attack on those plants as an outright disaster, not just economically, but in terms of basic human survival for tens of millions of people. Since 2006, Gulf countries have invested at least $53.4 billion in desalination infrastructure. Saudi Arabia alone has plans to invest around $80 billion more. And the Atlantic Council has already flagged a serious risk that a deliberate series of strikes on these plants could trigger the kind of regional instability that would make everything happening right now look manageable by comparison. Bloomberg has confirmed that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are privately debating whether to enter this war directly if their critical civilian infrastructure gets hit. Transcript context. The Orot Rabin strike, which proved Iran will follow through on infrastructure threats, just made that conversation a great deal more urgent. Even before the Orot Rabin strike, global energy markets were under historic pressure. Oil prices surged over 25% in the first week of the conflict alone, with Brent crude hitting its largest weekly gain since 1983. By early March, oil was already trading above $91 per barrel. By mid-March, it crossed $100. And as of this week, analysts are warning it could hit $120 if the war risks keep escalating. The Strait of Hormuz blockade has halted shipments from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Kuwait, locking in roughly 140 million barrels, or about 1.4 days of global consumption, away from international refiners. Qatar's LNG terminal has already taken damage, reducing global gas supplies and directly affecting energy prices in Europe and Asia. Web transcript context. JP Morgan analysts noted the market has stopped merely assessing geopolitical risk and started confronting actual operational disruptions, refinery shutdowns, and export limitations that are materially constricting supply. The Orot Rabin strike adds another layer of fear to markets that were already at their breaking point. Investors are asking a straightforward question. If Iran is willing to hit civilian power infrastructure inside Israel, what's next? The water systems? The financial grid? The communications networks? Once the precedent is set that civilian energy infrastructure is a legitimate wartime target, there is no logical stopping point. And that uncertainty, that open-ended what comes next, is precisely what drives the kind of volatility that translates into higher costs for everything, everywhere, for every person connected to the global economy. Against this backdrop, the diplomatic picture is almost painfully complicated. Pakistan has stepped up aggressively as the lead mediator in this conflict, with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif speaking directly with Iranian President Pezeshkian and pledging constructive engagement. Pakistan has been pitching Islamabad as a neutral venue for direct talks between senior U.S. officials and Iranian leadership, a proposal that one Pakistani diplomat described bluntly. Washington listens to Rawalpindi, and Tehran does not see Islamabad as hostile, That combination is rare in this conflict. There were reports that U.S. officials were expected in Pakistan for preliminary discussions, though Iran's Supreme National Security Council was still reviewing the proposal, with significant mistrust on Tehran's side about whether America was genuinely interested in a deal or just buying time. A senior Iranian official confirmed that the U.S. had requested a meeting with Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Meanwhile, Trump has been publicly projecting confidence, declaring progress, signaling imminent deals, telling the American public the situation is under control. Web transcript context. And then Iran hit a massive civilian power plant inside America's closest regional ally. That makes the ceasefire is close narrative harder to sell. It makes it harder to justify not escalating further, and it creates enormous political pressure on the Israeli government to respond in a way that matches the severity of what just happened to their energy grid. Talks happening in the background become infinitely more difficult when missiles are hitting power plants in the foreground. Here's the corner this war has painted everyone into, and understanding it explains why ending this conflict is so difficult. If Israel responds to the Orot Rabin strike by hitting Iranian civilian power infrastructure in an equivalent way, it fully validates Iran's approach. It confirms that targeting civilian energy systems is acceptable in this war and opens the door to the next level. Water systems, communications networks, financial infrastructure. Once both sides completely commit to hitting each other's civilian grids, the suffering of ordinary people becomes essentially unlimited. There is no natural stopping point. But if Israel and America absorb the Orot Rabin strike without a forceful response, they risk signaling to Tehran that attacking civilian power plants carries no meaningful consequence. And that signal would almost certainly invite more strikes, more power plants, more water facilities, potentially the desalination infrastructure across the Gulf that Iran has already publicly named. Military experts at Al Jazeera and CSIS have noted that Iran's tactics have worked in critical, limited ways. Iran has maintained a credible ability to strike U.S. bases, Israeli territory, and Gulf infrastructure, successfully raising the political and military costs of continuing the fight. But they also acknowledge the risks. Iran's proxy network has been severely degraded, Hezbollah has taken massive losses, and the resulting fragmentation could produce unintended escalation that even Tehran does not want and cannot fully control. The path out of this situation requires concessions that are politically painful on every side. Iran would need to accept verifiable limits on its nuclear program and stop supporting regional proxy forces. America would need to provide real sanctions relief and credible security guarantees. Israel would need to accept a regional order where Iran still exists as a power, even if diminished. None of those things are politically easy. All of them face intense domestic opposition in every country involved, and every missile that hits a civilian target makes the gap between what each side can agree to just a little wider. The Orot Rabin strike is a message. Iran chose this target deliberately and inscribed its intentions on the weapons it sent. The question now is what comes back in response, and whether that response brings this war one step closer to an end or pushes it toward something that nobody can walk back from. Watch Israel's response most closely. If Israel strikes Iranian civilian power infrastructure in retaliation, the rules of this war change permanently and dramatically. If it restrains itself and targets only military assets, there may still be a limit both sides are willing to respect, and that distinction matters more than almost anything else right now. Web transcript context. Watch the Pakistan mediation track. The Islamabad talks were already fragile. The Orot Rabin strike makes trust harder to build and concessions harder to justify politically on both sides. But the economic pressure on every government keeps growing. Oil above $100 a barrel is politically unmanageable in America for very long. That economic pain might ultimately be the thing that forces people back to the table when everything else has failed. Watch the Gulf states. Iran proved it will follow through on infrastructure threats. Saudi Arabia and the UAE now have to decide whether that proof changes their calculation about staying out of this war. The moment either of those countries enters the conflict directly, every assumption about how this war ends gets thrown out. One missile barrage at one power plant. Millions of civilians affected. Energy markets further destabilized. Diplomatic tracks under fresh strain. Alliance calculations being run and rerun in every capital in the region. This is not a footnote in a larger story. This is the story, and what happens in the next few days because of it will tell us whether the world is watching the end of this war or the beginning of its most dangerous chapter yet.